Hello guys, today we are going to try out the Qwik framework. It's a newly released framework that once again reimagines the way we build web apps in this modern era. We are going to explore what it does differently or better than other frameworks. We'll also try out a few of its features. One central concept you get from reading Qwik's docs is their focus on resumability, so we'll start there. Normally, if you want your web application to be interactive, you have to load JavaScript together with the page. But not all of your users may have JavaScript in their browsers. Some users disable JavaScript by default and therefore make your web application unusable to them. That's why frameworks like Next.js introduced the concept of server-side rendering pages. A server-side rendered page is compiled on the server and returns the HTML for your users visiting the page in the browser. So even if a user visits your page with JavaScript disabled, they are still able to view your content. There is no extra step of waiting for the page to be built by JavaScript. Once the HTML is loaded for the users, the frameworks then add interactive elements like event listeners to the DOM node and restores the application state of the component to make them interactive again. This process is called hydration. This process is very slow for a couple of reasons. When a user visits your page, the browser has to get the page HTML first, which is normally a quick process. Then it has to download all of the page's JavaScript and then pass and execute it. This is where your framework now traverses all DOM nodes of your app to add event listeners and make it interactive again. Executing JavaScript can be a really slow process, especially if you are using a mobile device with limited processing power. So your app may take a bit longer before it becomes interactive. Also, you have to remember here that your app will be built twice, once on the server to generate the HTML and another time on the client to make it interactive. So how do we remove this overhead and avoid doing the same work twice and also reduce load time? Qwik thinks it has the solution to that through resumability. A good way to differentiate resumability and hydration is by looking at them as push and pull systems. Hydration is a push system, as you have to download and execute the JavaScript eagerly to register all the event handlers just in case users need them after page. Resumability is a pull system. You do nothing when the page loads and do not register event handlers. You lazily create them only when the user needs to use them. The event handlers are serialized with the built HTML during rendering on the server. So when resuming, the handlers are deserialized, so there is no doing the same work twice. This is how the built HTML looks. When the above code loads in the browser, only the script that sets the global event listeners is executed instead of many event listeners per DOM node. The rest of the events are set in the HTML attributes, and the global listener will listen for events instructing it to load specific JavaScript code that makes the DOM elements interact. So the event listener code will only be loaded if the event is triggered. This makes the page load extremely fast, no matter the amount of event listeners or code you have. Let's try to set it up to see how it works. To set up Qwik, you run the command npm create Qwik in your terminal. The CLI will help you set up a scaffold for your new application. You can then cd into the directory and run npm start to start the application. A browser window will automatically be opened for you and you should see the following screen. Let's take a look at the files generated. The first thing you'll notice is the vit.config.ts file, which means that Qwik uses Vit. Vit is an extremely fast bundler for your JavaScript code. The plugins added here are Qwik Vit that loads the core framework and Qwik City, which is Qwik's folder-based router. The reason why they use two separate packages for Qwik is to allow independent development and improvement in each separate. If you have used Next.js, then you can think of Qwik Vit as React and Qwik City as Next.js, which works on the routing part. Another thing I noticed is in the package.json file, there's 4 commands for building your app. There's build, which will package both the client and server of your app, build client, which only builds the client version of your app, build preview, which will build a preview version of your production application so that you can look at it locally before deploying, and build types, which just generates a .ts build-info file that should increase build speeds every time you run the build, I think. In the src directory, there's 3 entry points, one for the client, one for the server during server-side rendering, and another for the preview that's used when running build preview. The routes directory houses all the routes that your app uses. Since Qwik supports file-based routing, routes flower index.ts here should render the page at localhost flower. Let's take a look at how the components look. This looks very similar to how React components look. They have borrowed the JSX syntax and even React hook. What's a bit weird is the use of $signs at the end of some of the API names. Turns out that it's a design decision and is a hint to the optimizer, telling it that some props or functions are going to be lazy loaded on the client. Styles can also be loaded in your app using the use style scoped hook, and you can add query parameters inside the import statements to load them inline, for example. You also use store hook to manage the application state. Let's set up a new page and try out some of these quick features ourselves. We can start by creating a simple counter page. First, we create the root by adding the folder counter with an index.ts file in it. This is an important detail here. Qwik's router is folder based and not file based. For other frameworks, you would just create a root counter.tsx file and it should work. But for Qwik, you need to add a folder for that route and must also add an index file in that folder for it to be picked up by Qwik. Also, when you visit the counter page, you'll realize that it doesn't load. It just loads a blank screen. If you check the logs in your terminal, you'll see a unsupported value was passed to the JSX error, which doesn't make a lot of sense. The only way I was able to fix this is by closing the server and restarting it again. In our components, we have used Qwik component import as a wrapper for our function component. We've also used the useStore hook to store the value of count. The hook creates a reactive store that when updated also updates the component. We update the store's value by directly setting state.count value. Our onClick event handler is going to be lazy loaded, so we add the $sign at the end of it. Another neat feature here is we can export a head constant that can set the page title easily. We can also add dynamic routes to our Qwik application. Let's say we want our counter application to be able to start counting at a dynamic number, like 100 or 50 instead of 0. To do so, we can create a dynamic route that will have the initial value parameter. So we create a folder named initial enclosed in square brackets and an index.tsx file for the component. In our component, we can use the useLocation hook to access the path parameter through location.params.initial and set this value as the initial value of our count state variable. We need to restart our server again to be able to see this dynamic page. After doing that, if you visit a new route like counter 50, the counter will start counting at 50 instead of 0. This number can be anything you want. Another feature that I'd like to touch on is loading data from an external source. Let's say that you want to retrieve our initial count value from the database. To do that, you need to add an onGet function in your component. In this function, you can query your database, for example, and return data. In our case, I've just added an artificial 2 seconds delay before returning a random counter value. To consume this data in our component, we use the useEndpoint hook to load that endpoint. We then use the inbuilt resource component and give it the endpoint data, a placeholder component to render in pending state while the data is loading, another component to render in error state if the onGet endpoint throws an error, and an onResolved prop that will render after the data is loaded. We can then access the data in this prop and use it in our component. If you refresh the page, you'll see that it takes at least 2 seconds to load the new counter value and then display it on screen. The loading state doesn't seem to be loading for us though, but if you really need to see it, you can change the mode in your start script in package.json from SSR to dev and restart the server. If you refresh the page, you'll see the loading view displayed. There's still lots of features we haven't touched on, including static site generation, service workers to allow your Qwik site to work offline, and also deploying your site to the edge using Cloudflare pages or Netlify edge functions. So if this interested you, you can visit their website to learn more about these features and more. Thanks for watching and hope you enjoyed the video.